As an interdependent global economic web, we are mutually dependent on one another's imports, exports, fiscal and monetary stability. Imbalances and bad investments that culminated to a tipping point in 2008 set off a domino effect of instability and currency fluctuation. Now, while countries fight to combat the economic aftermath of account deficits and overvaluation, many have begun launching competitive devaluation tactics by using their currency as a weapon to expedite economic growth. Now, although this is a pretty clear-cut description of the current state of our global economy, it sounds probably just as convoluted as our economic web has come to be. In simpler terms, our interdependency and the current economic stability has put countries on the defensive. They're trying to save themselves without regard to their trading partners, and they're using their currency as a shield, or in some cases a sword. First, I'm going to bring up 3 currency war cases that emerged in 2010, but I also want to emphasize the notion of persistent account imbalances that I will clarify later as the root cause of the crisis we're suffering today. The Brazilian real. Brazil's economy is booming. With high interest rates, they've seen tremendous foreign capital investment, and while the high value of the real, imports to Brazil have skyrocketed. Brazilians are off traveling and spending money abroad, but the real isn't just experiencing a high value, it's experiencing overvaluation, which has the potential to implode. The Swiss franc. With the struggling euro, EU investors have been looking to the Swiss franc as a safe investment. Like Brazil, this influx of investment has overstimulated the Swiss economy, putting it in an economic imbalance. The Chinese renminbi. Unlike the Brazilian real and Swiss franc, the Chinese renminbi is a fixed currency, and in today's economy, it's being held for safety. What's interesting is that as opposed to the real and the franc that float freely and automatically adjust with the economy, the renminbi is being purposely held at a lower rate. It is undervalued and thus causing its trading partners, specifically us, to accuse China of artificial currency manipulation. But why would we complain if our Chinese imports are cheaper? So here we have 2 cases of overvalued floating currency and 1 case of an undervalued fixed currency. But in order to understand how these currencies reached these threatening points, I'm going to explain the economic bits and pieces that created this tension. So how is currency valued? First off, the demand for a country's currency is based on their balance of payments, which is essentially their account balance after adding their current and capital accounts. Generally, a country's balance, which is just like a credit report, will dictate whether or not they're a safe investment. This, coupled with the return on investment, or interest rate, dictates whether or not they're a profitable investment. So the balance of payments, or BOP, equals the current account plus the capital account. A country's current account records goods, services, and transfers between one country and the rest of the world, like raw materials, merchandise, tourism, royalties, and investment earnings. Money owed to foreign countries are debts, and money owed by foreign countries are credits. Together, these debts plus the credits equal the current account balance. What the current account is missing is all of the financial transactions between one country and the rest of the world, which is where the capital account comes into play. The purchase of foreign bonds, land, currency, or businesses is capital outflow. The purchase of domestic bonds, land, currency, or businesses by foreign sources is capital inflow. Thus, as it has been with the United States since 1991, a country can only have a current account deficit, meaning it spent more than it earned, if it has a capital account surplus, meaning that other countries lend it enough money to pay off its deficits. Or the inverse, a capital account deficit equals a current account surplus, meaning a country's income is greater than its expenditures and its savings has been lent to countries with deficits. Either way, whichever side the deficit or surplus is on, current or capital, the accounts are supposed to add up to zero. Emphasis on supposed to. According to the International Monetary Fund reports, there is currently a negative discrepancy between capital and current accounts that it blames on misreporting and lag time. And to add to this disappearing money, the Encyclopedia of Economics notes that the world ran a current account deficit averaging more than $95 billion annually during 1995 through 2003, which is about the entire GDP of Morocco or Pakistan missing. So depending on whether a country's balance of payments is in deficit or surplus, signifies the strength of that country's economy, currency, and interest rates. Interest rates are raised by central banks to attenuate inflation. This is done to promote foreign investment and grow the value of a currency. Rates are lowered to promote borrowing and thus spending, which both stimulates the economy and promotes exports, but also devalues the currency. Key point. Interest rates play a pivotal role in the value of currency, since they're the biggest driving force behind the demand of a country's currency. High interest rates equal a high return on investment for a lender, but interest rates are generally high when the value of currency is high, which equals expensive money with uncompetitive exports. Low interest rates equal a low return on investment for a lender, but interest rates are generally low when the value of currency is low, which equals cheap money with competitive exports. So, to bring this back to our example of the Swiss franc and Brazilian real, in a global recession, profitable investments are limited. Switzerland, as a long-standing Euro-central bubble of monetary solidarity, and Brazil, as a burgeoning beanstalk with high interest rates, have been flooded with crisis-prompted foreign investments. These types of massive investments of buying and selling currencies on the foreign exchange market, or forex, are the cause of the up and down valuation ticks of foreign currency. The more of a currency purchased, the less available on the market, which causes a higher value. Extreme cases like the franc and real buying frenzies have caused overvaluation. When a currency is overvalued, its exports become too expensive to trade, which results in a trade deficit, more imports than exports. This overvaluation threatens to cause even slower growth of the Swiss and Brazilian economies in the midst of a global recession, if preventative monetary policies aren't enacted. The Brazilian real in recent days has appreciated to about 1 real 70 to the dollar, a 9% gain so far in 2012. This was reported by the Wall Street Journal. The stronger real hurts Brazilian exporters and manufacturers. In Switzerland, the franc was reported to be more than 40% overvalued, compared to both the dollar and euro, according to the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. To sum up the Swiss and Brazilian overvaluation crisis, if their governments don't do something to devalue their currencies, they will spend their way into an economic collapse by essentially losing their customers. On the other extreme is China. And I do want to emphasize extreme here because it is only extremes that drive countries to currency wars, from the Great Depression of the 1930s to the Asian financial crisis of the late 90s. The controversial point here is that China's renminbi is undervalued. If an overvalued currency causes goods and services to be too expensive to export, an undervalued currency would cause exports to be cheap. Now, why would this anger the big economic ringleaders with their made-in-China imports, which is mainly us, as well as China's biggest importer, the 27-country-strong European Union? Well, With Chinese goods so cheap, there's no incentive to buy domestic products. As Americans and many other countries gobble up Chinese goods, we are simultaneously pulling money out of our economies and injecting it into China, leaving China with huge trade surpluses. A $27.2 billion US dollar surplus as of January 2012, to be exact. Basically, the devaluated renminbi, held tightly by the Chinese government at its low level, is China's weapon against the recession. As a result, China has been accused of exacerbating slow economic growth by us and competing exporters internationally. Now, how can China hold their currency at a specific rate? Unlike the Swiss, Brazilian, and U.S. currencies that float freely in accordance with the ebb and flow of the market, China's currency is under tighter control. The renminbi was pegged to the US dollar up until 2005, when it was released and repegged to a basket of currencies: the dollar, euro, yen, and Korean won. However, from the currency rates within the basket, it was allowed only a very narrow margin of fluctuation. The renminbi did see a 21% appreciation from 2005 through July of 2008, when it was again pegged to the flagging US dollar to shield itself and its growth from the international recession. Thus, between our depreciating dollar and the China's thriving economy, the renminbi was held practically stagnant and gravely undervalued until 2010. When the Chinese government loosened its clinch on the renminbi to satisfy pressure from abroad. According to the New York Times, as of February 2012, however, it is still undervalued relative to all other currencies by 5 to 20%. So is it fair to have both fixed and floating currencies competing in our global economy? Well, actually, fixed exchange rates and floating exchange rates are trade-offs. According to Thomas Oatley, the author of International Political Economy, the international monetary system requires governments to choose between currency stability and national economic autonomy. What Oatley is referring to is that with a floating exchange rate, a currency is completely dependent on the market to dictate its currency's value, but has the freedom to impose monetary policy to manipulate it. Whereas a country with a fixed exchange rate has its currency pegged to the value of a stronger currency to ensure greater stability. But as a result, it doesn't have the autonomy to institute monetary policy to modify the value of its currency to deal with other internal economic issues. So how is the value of currency regulated? These systems of currency valuation, but more specifically the lack of regulation of how currencies are manipulated and valued, is in great debate, and should be. Initially, regulating authorities were established after World War II, when a modified method of the gold standard was implemented. In 1944, the world fixed their currencies to the US dollar, and the U.S. government fixed the dollar to gold. Thus, the U.S. dollar became the foundation or reserve currency of the international community. The International Monetary Fund, the IMF, was created to monitor exchange rates and lend reserve currencies to nations with trade deficits. The World Bank was also instituted to provide loans to help foster underdeveloped nations. By 1971, however, inflation fluctuations and the price of gold and low reserves forced the U.S. to abandon the established fix with gold and float. Other developed countries jumped on the boat, while less developed nations maintained hold to their anchor on the U.S. dollar. The dollar retained its position as the world's reserve currency, but now it was backed not by gold, but only by trust and the fact that oil and other commodities were traded around the world in dollars. As the world's currency provider, the U.S. must retain a current account deficit as the Fed continues to print inflate and distribute dollars around the globe. A resolution to this grave imbalance and instability of the U.S. dollar has been vocalized by economists around the world. Keynes was right, they say. As economist John Maynard Keynes advised in 1944, when he objected to the U.S. dollar being appointed the international reserve, a regulated world currency would be a more secure way and would endure. So, with the ability to manipulate monetary policy, which is money supplied and interest rates, and fiscal policy, which is taxation and spending, what have Switzerland and Brazil done to deflate their overvalued currency? Brazil has boldly imposed taxes on foreign investment inflows to prevent or slow investors from buying up the value of the real and basking in Brazil's 10.5% interest rate, as compared to the 0.25% rate in the U.S. as of January 2012, for example. But according to Guido Mantega, Brazil's finance minister, a trading floor will not be imposed on the real. In a more extreme defense to weaken the franc, in September of 2011, the Swiss National Bank took hold of its floating exchange rate and set a floor to fix it against the euro. The franc had appreciated greatly to be nearly on par with the value of the euro. So, to shield their economy, the Swiss grounded it at 1 franc 20 to the euro. On top of pegging their currency, the Swiss National Bank also cut its main interest rate to 0. And how has China responded to international pressure to equalize the value of the renminbi? When the undervaluation of the renminbi hit headlines at the beginning of 2010, it was undervalued by 25%. With international pressure and accusations of currency manipulation, the Chinese let the renminbi appreciate to where it is today, still undervalued but now by 10%. It is currently worth about 16 cents on the US dollar. With goals of economic development and modernization, China is following the path of other industrialized nations, specifically us, who grew to power based on exports. As the third largest economy in the world and the single biggest foreign holder of U.S. government debt, China, however, has no obligations to bend any further. A major fear of these currency wars is policy retaliation and countries working against one another as though their currency and economy exist in an isolated bubble, and that the acknowledgement that we are, more than ever, dependent on one another to grow and thrive is foreign, for lack of a better term. Aggressive and malicious currency devaluation during global recessions disrupts the allocation of scarce resources and slows the growth of other countries, who are both competitors and clients in this globalized economy. Additionally, in the case of China, other issues like intellectual property theft and barriers to entering Chinese markets are adding to the drag on economic growth. Of course, defending one's currency from overvaluation through policy is necessary, but as the finance minister of the world's 7th largest economy, Brazil, upheld, coordination of economic policies and the promotion of greater international growth can be more beneficial for the whole world that we are. And while this cooperation in our global economy is vital, consensus among international economic players has proven to be almost impossible. So, as currency wars wage on within our obfuscated economic system, we remain without a central organization to regulate and enforce rules. This ongoing chaos makes the proposal for one global currency sound as though it may be a fair remedy for today's unregulated currency manipulation. However, some argue that a global currency will hurt democratic freedoms. Andrew Marshall from the Center for Research on Globalization wrote that the very concept of a global currency and global central bank is authoritarian in its very nature, and it removes any vestiges of oversight and accountability away from the people of the world and toward a small, increasingly interconnected group of international elites. Thus, While unifying on the foundation of a single currency might stabilize us as a whole, it's getting there and agreeing on regulations in a fair and efficient manner that is the incessant battle.